members, please do ask the questions. The experts would be taking it later. Professor PK would have to leave by 5:30, so we may extend a bit more than our timeline of 5:30, but we would allow Professor PK to speak, make his interventions first.
Thanks, Amrita. If it's okay with you, I might start with a few general comments before getting down to your specific question. So here's what I'd say. I'd say that among all the, having been in this kind of tech policy space for about 4.5 years now, of all the reports that have come out of committees, I think this is among the best ones, right? And the reason it is among the best ones is because we keep crying with every other thing that you're trying to do too much. This report really nails it in keeping it extremely narrow, being extremely explicit about what are the areas that it does not cover. So keeping sovereign things out of it, keeping some of the B2B data sharing out of it, etc., I think is an extremely good thing to do, which you don't see in Indian policy making as often. The second thing is, one might think it's maybe not the simplest, but it's certainly an extremely elegant mechanism through which data is flowing. It's almost like everything's above ground, right? There is, these HUDs get created. The HUDs have to be made available on no discrimination basis, that there is the metadata directory that people can actually check up. So there's a lot of transparency in how things happen, which I think also very often does not happen because lots of regulation have more secretive elements. So to that extent, I really think we should commend the committee for taking on board all the feedback, 1,500, I don't know how they got through it, but in actually coming up with this kind of report. My concerns from the report come from the fact that at the end of the day, if this framework gets implemented like this, which it probably won't, right? Because there's going to be a legislative process after that, which the committee recommends, and things might change very significantly there. But if it does come into force in this kind of framework, then the truth of the matter is it's not going to be people like us who are going to be dealing with it. Parminder is not going to be, or may not be on the non-personal data authority. It's not going to be folks like us who will be it's not going to be people like us who are going to be on the data requesters, etc. The real life incentives and accountability mechanisms, because when this hits the road, lots of things might not play out as the theory would have said it does. And therefore, in that context, I have 3 specific recommendations in that sense, and then I'll come to your question about the businesses. Firstly, I don't see enough of incentives and accountability in this report. So for example, and what I'm discussing with a lot of startups is their concern, apart from their concerns, they say that it's very easy for us to bypass this by just feeding gibberish into the system. Someone asks you for data, give them terrible data, give them bad data or whatever. It's very easy to game the system. How do you make sure that the data provider is a responsible data provider and providing the right kind of information that has been asked for? How do you ensure that it is being only used for public good? Because it says that here are all the grounds on which the data requester can actually use this data. But why should they use the data like that? Even if they use it for something totally different, there's nobody to hold them accountable in this framework. So those kind of questions become really important. Data trustee has been asked to ensure that public good purpose is always met by data requesters. But how do you ensure it if you have no discretion? And if you have discretion, then how can you make the no discrimination kind of policy come to life? So this whole entire incentives and accountability mechanism, I thought, can be detailed a lot further. The second, which Asta has already alluded to, so I'll skip, is around the duty of care. It's been referred to in the context of both the data trustee as well as the data requester, but I don't think it's in that, also the data custodian, but it's not necessarily been defined. What does it mean? And that creates ambiguity for businesses, because if you say that, look, you are responsible for the harms and you've not been told what these harms are, you've not been told how can you be held accountable, it's a problem for them. And finally, I think there's a very big missed opportunity here in bringing in some of the regulatory best practices. The NPDA will be a regulator, it's going to be an Indian regulator, and we know so much about Indian regulatory governance, and it would be a missed opportunity if in the next version of the report, the committee does not bring the best practices of Indian regulatory governance into this. We have seen Indian regulators have do not do as much public consultation. We know that they aren't necessarily as transparent in the kind of reports that they put out. We know that their boards are not necessarily either independent, they aren't independent, they don't have majority non-execs. And we know that in effect, they struggle if they have to regulate too many entities, and therefore to preserve their bandwidth, they almost create a system of scarcity. And if they end up creating a system of scarcity here, and if not enough HVDs are getting created, defeats the whole purpose of the bill. So I think these are the three things around incentives and enforcement, around the duty of care, and around the regulatory best practices that I think this report would do well in. I think it's really got its heart in the right place. I think it's got the fundamental right, and it's some of these nut and bolt issues that need to be figured out. And now, Amrita, coming to your question about the startups and the impact on that. I think, look, having spoken to enough startups about these kind of things, the two things they always ask for is it has to be somewhat predictable, right? It's the lack of predictability which often puts startups into a soup, like in the sense that startups will do a certain thing and 2 years later you told them they did the wrong thing. So in that context, I think what would be really important is to clarify some of these definitions, clarify some of these benchmarks on what basis they are set, clarify some of these obligations, clarify some of these accountability. As long as I think all of that happens from a startup perspective, one might argue it might not actually make that much of a difference, because does the public good actually purpose cover the commercial aspects of a startup? So the commercial interest, we don't know, and I suppose will be defined later. But from the perspective of, does this create additional costs for startups? For all we know, they might be below that benchmark. So it really depends on how these benchmarks are set. So I'll pause there, Amrita, and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Shubhashish. Next, I bring in Amol. Amol, I want to know from you, do you foresee any regulatory overlaps between the NPDA and the other regulators?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amrita, for this opportunity. And also thank you to the members of the committee for being so open and forthright with receiving the feedback. Now, before delving into your questions, just some broad thoughts on what committee members have said during this discussion, what we could grasp from the report. Definitely, I also concur with other panelists to say that this is a fantastic effort and much needed improvement over the previous version. But here are my few reservations before I move to answer your questions. First is, I completely understand this obsession to be leader in the world and take first mover advantage when it comes to regulating some of these issues which are non-regulated or less understood around the globe. But this need to regulate, or obsession to regulate, without necessarily thinking about socio-economic realities of the country and the capacity of individual consumers, communities, and citizens at large, may be counterproductive. I think we have in our country experiment a lot with the concept of regulation by intentions. We need to move beyond regulation or governance by intentions. We have had a lot of bad experiences with things which were thought were good enough or were for the benefit of the country or citizens, but it didn't turn out to be that, because unintended consequences and adverse effects of some of the knee-jerk regulatory reactions were not thought through clearly. The second thing is about state capacity, which is also somewhat related to what was said by Shubhashish and Astha, and I don't want to repeat that, but as I said, that the committee members might be clear in their head about what they want to achieve, but that might not really be what might be the text of the legislation and how it will be implemented. And there is a real risk of getting the concepts and objective being lost in translation and using the powers which is mentioned in the report for some other purposes rather than for the public good purposes which is mentioned in the committee, which is mentioned in the report. And the third thing is about Parminder and others have said that the real idea is to consider data as an infrastructure here, and also very fantastic lucid examples of roads. And I'm glad that this example was brought today, because as we speak, the country is celebrating the National Road Safety Month. And why we are celebrating this? Because the road safety is very important, and road accidents create a lot of adverse consequences and deaths to common citizens in the country. And this is important because roads, as we know, are sort of laid down by through a public-private sort of a partnership, which is also something which is envisaged by the country, by the committee. And therefore there is this sort of questions as to, okay, if you're saying that data is infrastructure and we should think about roads being sort of laid down, so then what about the rights of people who are sort of dispossessed, and who is responsible for rehabilitating them? What is that the only road that people are supposed to travel, or there could be some other roads, and whether there would be no sort of permission to travel through other roads which could reach to the destination sort of sooner? Or so is this the only way to do things, or there could be other ways? Because we have seen technology being the only mechanism to avail certain government benefits, and there is no sort of technology or manual override or no fail-safe mechanism in different context. What about sort of accountability? Is if the road design is bad, or if there are some accidents, or if there are tolls which are sort of placed on for traveling to roads, there are real risk of exclusion from usage of roads, and therefore, by example, of usage of the public interest for which the data will be used by data requester when it is sort of used for public interest. And who will sort of tell you that, or who will sort of regulate whether or not the charges which are levied on citizens to use the road are reasonable or not? Uh, who is responsible if there is some sort of problem in terms of designs of road, or the material in which through which the road is constructed? So is data trustee accountable? Is the data custodian accountable, or is the data sort of requester accountable? So again, if you think about the experience of public-private partnerships and infrastructure regulation, when it comes to sort of considering data as an infrastructure, there are real questions and real harms which the country has experienced, and we need to benefit from our experience and not just sort of take into account benefits of considering data as infrastructure or a road, but also think about what could be the adverse unintended consequences in this regard. Uh, so these are like two sort of broad feedback or responses to the committee, and now I'll come back to your questions on regulatory overlaps. I see regulatory overlaps and need for sort of regulatory coordination at different levels. Let's first start with philosophical level. Now, at philosophical level, the committee is saying that data is a sort of, it's invoking constitution, and it's saying that data is a material resource, and therefore there is a need to sort of take it away from data monopolies and distribute it amongst citizens for greater good. Now that is okay, but the mechanism which it is proposing, that the data needs to go through the trustees, which there is a risk of resulting into data monopolies themselves, is somewhat problematic, because at one hand you are saying that data monopolies are bad, and at other hand you are again creating data trustees which might result into data monopolies in which there is less transparency, accountability. Also, there is this sort of a dichotomy about whether data actually is a material resource, because material resource is limited in nature, but data by definition is not limited, and therefore you could use it in a way you want it to be. You want to use it. The second sort of overlap I see is at conceptual level, and I think some of this has been discussed, but just for the sake of brevity, while the committee members seem to suggest that there is no sort of ambiguity or overlap between definition of personal and non-personal data, there is a real risk of sort of lack of identification of if the non-personal data becomes identifiable, when did that happen during the value chain, and who is to be held accountable for that. So when it comes to sort of risks, harms, and breaches during the value chain and during the data sort of transfer, it might be a little bit difficult to sort of hold people accountable and identify when did the breach happen. The second problem, which perhaps is about the role of data businesses within the NPD framework and role of significant data fiduciaries under the PDP. So is there sort of double regulation, over-regulation, because you have to comply with some conditions there and you have to comply with some conditions there, which might actually result in regulatory arbitrage and data businesses. And also, given that there is an opt-out mechanism, there is a real risk of data, personal data not being anonymized, which has its own sort of privacy risks and other such risks. There is also sort of overlap in it when the committee says that NPDA is a regulator, but also is a repository of metadata directories. So in a sense, it also holds a lot of data, and what are the sort of security and other features to ensure that these metadata directories are safe, secure, and not misused is something we'll have to think about. Another one is the role of is the scope of public interest, which the committee has said. So the scope of public interest includes innovation, employment generation, value addition, amongst other things, which are sort of good. And when we think about all these issues, these are really sort of in the domain of sectoral regulators or departments, because in their respective sectors, they are required to ensure the sector grows in a certain way, and there is innovation, and there is sort of equitable considerations are taken into account, and there is employment generation. So at one hand, you are saying that the scope of public interest is innovation, employment, and on the other hand, you are saying that there is no sort of conflict between sectoral regulators and the NPDA. So that is some problematic. And mind you, I'm not talking about only central or federal level regulators. There are regulators and government departments at the state level. So there could be a lot of sort of areas of overlap between central regulators, NPDA, cross-sectoral regulators like the Competition Commission of India, on which I'll come just a bit, and the proposed sort of e-commerce regulator, which might also be a cross-sectoral regulator.
Sorry to interrupt you, but if you do not mind, Professor PK would be leaving. Can we just have 2 responses? I'll come back to you if it's not an issue with you.
Absolutely. Sure.
I'm so sorry.
No problem.
But Professor PK, there are just 2 things which we would want to hear from you. One was what Professor Pingali actually elucidated to, and the second is how do you look at this report going from now, and what is your wish list, and what do you think may be the challenges? We can't hear you.
I will like Parminder also had, but I think the way that we are talking, we have already started getting the, so to say, we've been doing multiple consultations, even after putting the draft 2 out. We've had, like I think 2 weeks back, we had an industry consultation where some of us participated again, getting inputs. Inputs are coming from different places. We ourselves are also hearing the input, because this government process, wherever the inputs are coming, we're going to get it at some point in time. We'll have insights into the feedback there. And in the process, we have started getting looking at some of the feedback already and started revising. I think this definition, I think Asta was saying, some definitions needs to be clarified. So Asta, just to give you a sense, in one of the earlier report, we actually had huge amount of content generated only for what anonymization is and different methods. It was something I was saying that, look, from the computer science point of view, I can give you, okay, here are different methods. I was also articulating that no methods can be foolproof. I think let's not assume that, oh, this anonymization kar diya, I applied company A, applied anonymization on it, and it will all work. It's not possible, right? It is going to be. So we spent a lot of time, and then when we were putting it out, we said that, look, this looks too detailed. This looks too, already the first version itself is so long, so we kind of cut it down. So it looks like something we probably have to go back and look at it. So I completely agree that some definitional information needs to be more clarified. All that we did from version 1 to version 2, but I think we're getting that back also. We'll definitely do that. Amrita, your question to what is our wish list? I think the chairman and everybody is also trying to say that let's try and get the feedback sooner. I think the current deadline, if I'm right, is the 31st January. So once that comes out, about a couple of weeks later, we should have everything sorted out. So there is a very detailed process also we follow. We look at it, we kind of discuss each one of them, and then put it into some buckets, and then look at feedback. So that's what I think the process is going to be. I think Subhashish also mentioned about some of the best practices of NPDA. So we've discussed a little bit. See, because I think sometimes the view is also that I think Subhashish rightly pointed out that we as committee members created, but there's going to be a huge process after that. We don't even, at least I don't have an insight on what that process is going to be. We're seeing that process for the personal, right? PDP bill. I don't know what all direction it's going to say, who's going to change what, how will it go. For now, our intentions are good that we want to try and make our best efforts in giving things. Hopefully, we'll also be part of the process of it getting converted and we'll contribute in the process, right? But I like what Amol said. I don't know, Parminder, whether you caught it. Amol said that there's an obsession to regulate. I don't know whether any of us have that obsession, please. I like the word that you said, we're being in this obsession of creating new things. I think that's what you said. No, I don't think so. The intention was that, look, nobody is doing so, we should do it. And I think we understand. Even in our first meeting, really first few months, we actually met with international experts. There were people from Hong Kong who gave us discussions about what's going on. There's somebody from the US who gave, UK, somebody actually came and gave us a presentation on what they're thinking. So we took some insights, but of course there is this, as Parminder emphasized, is also that this topic is not very well, so to say, discussed or done a lot of work, which we are also saying. We're also getting inputs that look across the world, this is not done, so it's interesting to do. So Amrita, that would be my next steps of adding some definitions, probably creating more clarity. I think even in the industry interactions that we had, some feedback had come very concretely. We had made a note of it. So that would be my next steps, I would say.
Thank you so much, Professor PK. Professor Pingali had a question. Professor Pingali, would you want to ask the question again, just in case?
So this was regarding innovation and hurting innovation, right? I mean, that's the question that I had posed at the beginning stages. Along with seeing that whether the data contribution ultimately we'll see would come down, actually the incentives to collect data in the first place would come down.
So Parminder, do you want to take it? But Professor Pingali, and I did not, so I wrote down some of the questions that you had, but I'm not too sure where the thing of the innovations was come down, because we are in our discussion, we are seeing that some of these innovations, it can actually sparkle more innovations, but I need to really, I'll let Parminder also answer if he has a view on it. Parminder, you're on mute again, Parminder. Sorry.
Economist carries an article 4 weeks back in which there is an Oxford professor who has done a research, and they have clearly come out that startups today have less of a problem of capital and more of a problem of data. That's a research, is an Economist article. I can forward it to you. Second, you were saying about disincentivizing production of data. That's an issue. Society's need is not production of data. It is also use of data. The use is the reason data is produced. So there are different trade-offs. The infrastructure formula increases the use of data. The same data which is in the hosts is being productively used. So the social benefit is in the maximum use of data. I can understand that increasing use can reduce production, and the production reduces, the total use will be reduced. No, that doesn't happen. First of all, we should recognize increased use is good for the society, not just increased production.